Welcome to the Coptimizer podcast, a platform dedicated to uncuffing your true potential in public safety. We're here to provide you with valuable tips and insights that will help you optimize your life and career. I'm retired Chief Patrick Flanley, and I'm honored to be your guide and coach on this journey. Here, I'll share the latest insights and strategies to help you survive and thrive in the demanding world of public safety. Our noble duty is to protect and serve. We embody the role of peacemakers in our communities. However, this profession's immense physical and mental demands come with a price. If we fail to take a proactive approach for our well-being and lead ourselves first, then the stress from the job can and will lead to poor health outcomes. We have all seen it play out. Not only does this impact our professional and personal lives, but it also affects our ability to fulfill this sacred duty. Like many of you, my journey has been filled with tremendous challenges, with highs and lows. However, through creativity, experience, and a positive attitude, I successfully managed over 30 years in law enforcement, emerging healthy and happy. Now, I am driven to share what I've learned to show you that the path is not all doom and gloom. There is hope and a profound purpose in serving your community, and I'm here to show you that it does not have to come at the cost of your health and well-being. Join us as we explore cutting-edge research, interview top experts, and share inspiring stories of transformation. Whether on duty or off, it's time to optimize your potential and live your best life. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered. This is the Coptimizer Podcast. Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I generally like to say I have an exciting conversation. I do have a cool guest that I've been looking forward to speaking with for a long time. The topic, however, is just not one of those things that I just don't like the idea that we have to keep talking about this, and that's going to be about school safety, active shooters, and really school safety in a broader sense and how we respond, prepare, train, equip, all of these things. All of these topics are going to be germane to today's conversation with my guest, David Riedman. David, welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great to be a guest on a show.
Yeah, I've been following you for a while. I live in Indiana. I'm here in West Lafayette, which the backyard to Purdue University. And so I've had a lot of partnerships over the years with academics, academia. I enjoy working with academics. Sometimes, generally, in the broader sense, police departments and academia are they kind of clash, and that's whether you realize it or not. And I think you probably do. Your topic of discussion on LinkedIn primarily is where we communicate, and where I see you most often is sometimes controversial in law enforcement, because I'll just say it up front. Cops sometimes just don't like to be challenged from outsiders, people that they don't perceive, quote, understand the culture or the job of policing. And that can lead to some interesting conversations, but I also find personally that it's very important for growth, particularly for our profession that seems to be stuck in the dark ages at times. So that's kind of a long intro, but what I'm really curious about is your background as a data scientist and how you got interested in this topic to begin with.
Yeah, and if you wanted to throw any more fuel on the fire between reasons cops would want to argue with me, I actually started in the fire department. So
Man, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I wanted to be a paid firefighter. I started as a volunteer when I was 16. I went to college, and in the middle of my undergrad, Hurricane Katrina happened. And I've always had a desire to help people, to be involved in the biggest incidents. I was a little too young to respond to 9/11. People from my volunteer department went, got in a truck and drove straight to the Pentagon and straight to the Twin Towers. But I just missed that. I really felt like that was this incredible opportunity. So when Hurricane Katrina happened, I immediately took a leave of absence. FEMA was hiring anybody who was a credentialed firefighter to go down and work immediately as a reservist. So I spent about 9 months down in New Orleans right after Katrina. And that was really a life-changing experience for me. It got me into understanding emergency management. And that turned into most of my early career was working on federal level disaster response, emergency planning. But since Federal Emergency Management Agency sits within Department of Homeland Security, I had an opportunity to then move more into the terrorism and intelligence space. And it was from there that I had an invitation to go to the Naval Postgraduate School to get a degree in national security affairs. That's not a school that, a civilian can just enroll in.
Right.
It's through invitation. And then I was back there for a second 18-month think tank program around defining and understanding the future threats. Like what is Homeland Security 10 years from now? And I was sitting in a classroom talking about that when the Parkland shooting happened. And I realized that I had been in this emergency management and Homeland Security space at that point for, more than 10 years. And we never discussed a school shooting. We discussed the Boston Marathon bombing in detail, where 2 people died. There were 17 kids dead in this school, and that was never even on the radar as a Homeland Security issue. So I became really obsessed with trying to understand it. I wanted to collect as much information as possible. The day after Parkland, you couldn't say how many shootings happened in a school that year or that decade. Were the characteristics of them changing? Were the characteristics of the perpetrators changing? Because there was no kind of wide data collection on this. And now I've spent the last almost 7 years collecting information on about 3,000 different incidents. And data science is something that I've actually learned through this project. And now I'm hopefully finishing my PhD in artificial intelligence this coming year.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And all of those things, very seminal events. I had already been working in policing because I went into the military, into the Air Force right out of high school. I was a security police officer there. That came back to Purdue, worked a little bit, and then so I started as a police officer in 1995 as a 27-year-old, and I had a strong interest in tactics, tactical background stuff. So one of my first primary goals as a police officer was to try to get on, qualify and make our SWAT team. So I was able to do that. And one of the first things that happened early in my SWAT career was Columbine. And it's sad to this day, we still look back on that and we think we have learned a lot. Uh, and I don't want to seem like I'm being negative. We have learned a lot, but sometimes it seems like as much as we learn and have learned, we still keep making some of the same mistakes. And a lot of this, I believe, it's really a cultural problem. It's a mindset problem, and it's an organizational structure problem, the way that we think about response and training. And so that's kind of one of the things I want to get in with you today, because while we could talk for hours about these individual incidents, here was my big takeaway from Columbine. I, as a police officer, and that was even before I was a parent. So my first child wouldn't even be coming for another year. Now I have three. But we trained for this contain and call out. Like like the first thing you want to do is isolate any type of critical incident. You want to isolate it. You want to get the right resources in, which generally can be SWAT. It just depends on what you're working. But from an incident management perspective, right? This is what we're talking about. You have a small incident command structure that you're going to set up, and those incidents can scale depending on what you're talking about. But in the aftermath of that, one of the things that has never left me was listening to a parent in an interview in the following months from the incident when everyone's trying to, everybody's pointing fingers, everybody's blaming, everyone's trying to understand. All these things are always emotionally charged and rightfully so. But there was a parent that made this comment that, look, while my children were inside this school defenseless, while two armed suspects were walking around shooting, the only people that could help them were outside of the school setting up a perimeter. They're the ones that were trained, that they had the firearms, that had the guns, that could come in and save my children or our children, and they didn't. And it's like that's where this whole active shooter really kind of mindset started to evolve in the way that we train. So, you fast forward to, 20 years later, well, incidents like Parkland and others, we could talk about, all of these incidents, but you get to Uvalde, which was, another just, horrific incident. And, I think law enforcement did some things, some good things there, but they also had some catastrophic failures. And when you look at these, my perspective, again, there's a lot of things you can point to, but it comes down to mindset and this hierarchical structure and this idea like whose responsibility is it to solve the problem in the moment? And in policing, we have these top-down paramilitary structures where sometimes if we're not if we're not careful about how we train and prepare our frontline leaders, our young officers, the the default in stress is going to be, I'm going to wait for someone to tell me what to do because I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think the first point that's really interesting there is that Columbine was this defining moment to change police tactics. But Columbine is probably the worst example of any of these incidents because it's so different from all of the others. Columbine was planned to be a bombing that was going to be a bigger bombing than Oklahoma City. That's why there were propane tanks and IEDs all over the school. But they didn't go off because of a flaw in the way that the bombs were put together. And when the bombs didn't go off, they didn't really have a plan for what they were going to do when the bombs didn't go off. So they walked into the school and then just started roaming around looking for victims. And that became this bubble where the police are following their procedures at the time to contain, but neither of them would really fit the way that we think about an active shooter or a school shooter right now. They're really ideological domestic terrorists who were just stuck in this space with victims after the bombs didn't go off. And that hasn't been the scenario at any other school shooting since then. What's interesting is Columbine becomes this point that it's a reference, it's an image, it's an ideology, it's an inspiration to follow. But the shooters who commit the more current attacks aren't anything like the Columbine attackers were. And almost all of the school shootings now are really short duration incidents, and a lot of them are over before law enforcement even gets there. I mean, that was the case this past week in Madison, Wisconsin. The 15-year-old girl killed herself before the first police officer arrived. 2 weeks before that, at the Seventh-day Adventist school, this adult man who said he was visiting to enroll a student and then opened fire on the playground, he killed himself before police arrived. And at Perry, Iowa, at the start of this year, a student with a shotgun and a pistol, he was Columbine inspired. He was playing the same song that the Columbine shooters played. He opened fire in the hallway about half an hour before classes started, and he killed himself before the first police officer arrived. So Columbine was this domestic terrorist attack with bombs that didn't go off, and then kids roaming around because of the police surround and contain mentality. Almost all of your current school shootings are a deliberately planned attack, a surprise attack, and a very short duration incident that's usually done before law enforcement intervenes.
Yeah, and we have spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort trying to harden targets. And uh, I'm just not sure. I can't say that it's that we shouldn't be doing some of these things because we should. We should make schools hard targets for sure. However, just based on what you just said, right? That's the kind of like the dirty little secret is you can spend millions of dollars hardening a target. But if somebody is familiar with the school, that's been through the training inside of that school, that understands what's going to happen, we're they're not these are not dumb people. Like they're smart young kids, sadly, and they're going to find a way around.
And they're not
And
outsiders. I mean, that's
right.
that's the biggest piece. With with all of our policy, we always seem to borrow things from other places, but often it's incongruent. I mean, you
Yeah.
made the point about soft targets or hardening. That's something from counterterrorism. That's
Yep.
something from, a concept that was created in the 70s and 80s that if you have a public space, if you have an accessible space, that's a place where a terrorist can commit a bombing or commit an attack. A terrorist group is trying to advance their group's political ideology, and they want to do that in the most public way and the way that has the highest degree of success. Thus, you look for a soft target. But that term soft target doesn't apply to mass public shootings or school shootings because those are highly personal and highly individual. You have a person with a direct connection and knowledge to the place or the people there, and they commit something based on their own grievance and anger, and they want to die in a violent public suicide. They are not looking for the highest rate of success. They're looking to die in the place that they feel has wronged them. And it's really immaterial whether one person is killed or whether 20 people are killed. They just want to die during the attack. So there's actually some pretty compelling research that at schools that have an armed officer on the campus, the fatality rate is actually 3 times higher than schools that don't. And so if you want to have if you're a attacker and you're in crisis and you've decided you want to die in a violent public suicide, the really the really scary thing is that a school that's fortified and a school that has armed staff might be an even more attractive target because you know that you're going to die quickly.
And it also motivates you to get the job done faster before you have that confrontation, which is kind of, it it's like a lot of things that we respond to in policing. Most police officers at some point in their career are going to face a suicide by cop scenario where somebody, wants to die. They just, maybe they don't want to do it by themselves if they're looking for a different way out.
Yeah, you
Um,
also brought up the failures in Uvalde, and I think that's something that needs to be unpacked more. Because in the same way that we borrow policies that already exist and try to apply them to different situations, after 9/11, the idea of the incident command system got pushed out across the country. And to get federal grants, you have to be using ICS, you have to be using ICS training. But what happens in these really acute, intense, short duration incidents is ICS fails over and over.
yeah.
And that's because it was created in the 1970s for wildland firefighting, where you're going to have a big multi-day or multi-week incident. So in the first day or days of that incident, we're going to all get together. We're going to decide who's the West Division commander. We're going to set up our operational tempo. We're going to give people a bunch of colored vests. We're going to create our communications plan. That doesn't work in a situation that's 5 minutes or 10 minutes of duration. You end up having people think that they need to work within a structure, but there's not time to establish that structure. And then people's initial information gets lost because they're not communicating within the higher ups. If you listen to the audio from the Las Vegas Harvest Festival shooting, there are patrol officers saying exactly where the bullets are coming from, exactly where the shooting is. But you hear the sergeants and command officers talking about, who's in command where, who's going to be in this division, where are we going to assign these officers? So taking this system that's designed for a multi-day or multi-week incident and trying to collapse it into a short duration response creates all of this extra confusion. And it seems that we're actually going in the wrong direction with that.
Oh man. We're gonna need a much longer. I think we're gonna need more than an hour. I'll just say this real quickly. One of the things that we joke about, lightheartedly inside of policing, right, is the first 5 to 10 minutes of any incident, we just call it the circus. And even from a SWAT perspective, if a SWAT team is being deployed to an incident, generally, probably the most common type of deployment outside of search warrant execution is going to be like a barricaded subject, meaning there's some kind of domestic dispute, or somebody has run from a crime and now they're holed up inside of a house or a structure or a vehicle or something. So there you have the threat isolated, and time is on your side. So you can kind of start putting some of these structures in place. You can set up a tactical operation command, then an incident command, and if it becomes an extended incident, you can build these things out. What I'll tell people is, as a young police officer, if you're not working in that type of environment, then incident command is going to be a little bit foreign to you. What you're doing from an incident command structure is just instinctive. And an example I used to give our young officers is really, every and this whole concept around every officer a leader. Like, if you're waiting for someone else to tell you what to do, then you're already at least one step behind the curve. So you have to know what to do, and what we want is those that respond with you to be able to integrate into the situation uh, with with an understanding of what you have done and what you should have done, so we're not repeating ourselves and going backwards and forwards. And that's where I go back to this hierarchical leadership and these paramilitary structures. If you have a frontline supervisor that is, a do as I say, not as I do type of leader, and they got that big puffed out chest, they can't wait to go show people how smart they are. They're part of the problem right from the start, because they're going to get there and start asking questions where things should have already been done, instead of getting there with the mindset, like, where do I need to insert myself, and where can I help us move this a resolution forward.
And
And
the
we
fire department is the king of incident command. But
Yeah,
you do incident command on every incident, but it's interesting you talk about those 5 minutes of chaos, and the 5 minutes of chaos kind of decide how the long duration of the incident's going to go. But what's ironic in the fire department, if you respond for a call that you know is absolute BS, it's food on the stove during dinner time reported as a building fire.
right.
You better set up your command post. If you're the first unit on the scene, and you're the captain on that apparatus, you better call out every single person's position, designate who the safety officer is. And if you get there and the chief, sees somebody walking around without gloves and safety glasses, you're getting ridden up. But if you switch this scenario and it's a building fire, apartment fire with people hanging off the balconies, nobody establishes command. You can be on the ladder in your sweatpants, trying to get a victim down, and you'll end up getting a Medal of Honor for that. So we have this system that works really well when there's not any intensity and there's not any immediate critical action that you need to take. And it starts to break down as soon as people actually need to get work done. And I think you saw that in Uvalde. A lot of school shootings, a lot of mass public shootings are happening in tiny jurisdictions. A police chief has probably never been the incident commander of 100 plus officer response from multiple different jurisdictions. So that person's going to be underwater immediately. That Uvalde
Right.
school police chief, he's underwater. But if every other officer has been conditioned to, we only work within this incident command structure, they're all paralyzed. So we've created this system where a small town police chief is not going to succeed as an incident commander. And every officer is not going to succeed if they're looking for direction from the incident commander. And that's going to fail, and it has failed.
Yeah, and it's the fundamental attribution error, right? It's where we blame individuals for a system problem. Like, the way the system is set up, we're set up for failure right from the start. That applies in a lot of different ways. Let's use for Uvalde, for example. When you're one of the first, when you're one, and I thought they did a fairly good job right up until the point where they moved to contact, and then they retreated, and from there, that's when they went into freeze mode. And now we're starting to think, how do I think my way through this when action was really what was required? And again, that comes down to how have you trained? How have you prepared? Because that's the way you're going to react in a moment. So I'll use an example for the incident command from just a traffic accident. So you're an officer, you get dispatched to a four-car pileup at a busy intersection at rush hour. You're the first one there. What are you doing, right? You know EMS is on the way, you know fire is on the way, you know additional officers are coming there. So you have to triage right from the start. You have to assess, what do you see? Do we have injury? And if you do have injury, you're going to have to start thinking about how you're going to prioritize treatment for that. But before you can even do that, you have to think about scene safety, because you're in an intersection where vehicles are still moving. So you don't want to create additional injury or additional problem. So you very quickly you have to see it, you have to react, you have to make decisions, and sometimes those decisions aren't always right, but the only wrong decision is no decision, and that's where things get really complicated. And when you apply that same type of principle to an active shooter response, I do think we have evolved and we do that pretty well. Like, officers know the first thing I need to do is attack the threat, neutralize the threat, and then we can start thinking about creating warm zones and getting additional EMS or safety stuff in. Uh, and I think we probably have a mutual friend. I think you're familiar with someone here locally. His name's Todd Langley. He runs a company called Crisis Response Leader Training. Todd's been on the podcast. I would encourage people to go and listen to him, uh, and look at what he's working on, because he's trying to create a solution to help. He comes from a military background. He's been through all these types of incidents, real world live training. And then another person that's in common is Chris Grolnick from the Active Shooter Prevention Project. So I think there are people that are working on this problem. But
In general,
yeah, it's a
with
broad.
all of these things, whether it's how we want students to respond during a shooting at a school, how we want staff to respond, how we want police to respond when they get there, how we want fire and EMS to respond. I think when you have chaotic, unpredictable, and short duration incidents, it's important to empower people and give them as much flexibility as possible. And one of, I think, the flaws with the incident command system is we've created a lot of rigidity. We've created a lot of barriers where if somebody's not getting direction, they don't think that they can do something on their own. If you have an ambulance that arrives at a school and they see somebody who's wounded and bleeding, they need to be empowered to immediately say, we're going to load and go and transport. If you see an officer at a school and he thinks he has a shot at the shooter, he shouldn't be waiting for permission to take that.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
He shouldn't be saying, which is in the Uvalde
Yep.
tapes. There's an officer, he
Yep.
says, I've got this, should I do it? But that all comes down to constantly looking up for approval rather than empowering each person to make a decision. If you're a kid in a classroom or you're a teacher in a classroom and you hear gunshots, empower them to make whatever they think is the best decision in that moment. Do you have a door or a window in your classroom? Does it seem like it's the best idea to go out it? If that seems like it's the best decision, do the best decision. We need less structure, because what happens is if you have less structure, there's less predictability in the way that the response is going to unfold. And that takes the advantage away from the attacker. Because right now, the attacker, if it's a mass public shooting, if it's an act of terrorism, if it's a school shooting, the attacker knows exactly how the response is going to play out. So let's switch things to give officers and give the victims an advantage.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points there, because you've just nailed it. You've nailed it right there. And that's in today's. I think the general rule of thumb is we have this desire as adults to teach kids what to think rather than how to think. So I've had that same conversation with all three of my children, in how they approach their own safety in a school, whether it's run, hide, fight, all of these things. I've talked to them about all of those situations. Well, sometimes running is the right answer. Sometimes barricading the door is going to be the right answer. Sometimes fighting is going to be the right answer. So you have to weigh the risk and the reward. So I've even, I would just ask them scenarios. Okay, you're in your math class, you're on the third floor, you hear gunshots in the hall. What are you going to do? Um, and then we just kind of walk through it. Like, well, the right answer might be jumping out the damn window, on the
It
third
it
floor.
saved it saved hundreds of kids at Central
Yeah.
Visual and Performing Arts.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
you might break a leg, but it's better, you can survive a broken leg. You're not
yeah,
going to
the
survive a
the kids were
gunshot.
on the
So,
third floor and they jumped out of the windows. But also, we really need to think very carefully about what training we give officers, teachers, and students, because people don't understand how powerful that training is and how much it impacts you during a high intensity incident. You're not thinking, you're actually just going to do whatever you were trained to do. So the fire academy that I went through had a burn building that had these gas burners in the building for all the practice evolutions.
yep.
And if you got too much water on the gas burner, it wouldn't be able to relight for the next person's evolution. So as you did these training evolutions, you just cracked and sprayed the nozzle real fast so that you didn't actually saturate, your training environment. The very first building fire that I went in after I was out of the academy is, a rocket apartment fire. And I'm on the line and I pull it up, and immediately what I do is crack it and close it. And the captain who's behind me slaps me in the back of the helmet like so hard that it almost knocked my helmet off. And he opened the damn bail. And the problem is, if you trained 1,000 times in the academy to just crack it and close it and then back out so that the next person could do their training evolution, when it's 3 in the morning and you're full of intensity for your first fire ever, you're going to do exactly the same thing. And that's what's going to happen in a school with gunshots. If you've practiced over and over since kindergarten that we're going to turn the lights off and crawl into the corner and be silent, and you've done that multiple times a year, every single year, when that alarm goes off or when that gunshot happens and your brain is in panic mode, it's really not panic mode, your brain is in silent mode, and you're just following what you learned. Now you've taken away somebody's opportunity to maybe take the life-saving and the best action for them.
Yeah, and that plays out in a lot of different ways. I'll give a similar example on the police side. We had a shooting. This right before I got hired. Shooting in an emergency room where somebody came in, was threatening people in the ER with a firearm, and at the time we carried wheel guns, so we were carrying 357s, and the officer wound up taking two shots at the suspect, hitting and striking the suspect. You know, ends the situation. But in a debrief later, he shot two rounds, and then he found like his all of the four um, remaining rounds and two empty casings were in his pocket because he fired the two, dumped them into his hand, put them in his pocket, took out his speed loader and put them in. And that was fairly common. So one of the lessons that you learn in policing and in a training environment, right, is like, hey, let's train the way that we're actually wanting people to respond. That's an incident that's 30 years old, but
Which is,
I've done
but it
similar things, right?
highlights
Yeah.
it highlights this impossible situation that we're putting teachers into
Yes.
right now, because roughly half of the states in the country allow teachers to be concealed carrying in the school. And there are no national training standards. Most states don't even have a state training standard. So it could be something where the principal just signs off and says, okay, you can do this. It might be a 2-hour seminar. It might be a couple-hour seminar that the police department puts on, or in some cases, somebody might go through, a more rigorous training program. But you're taking a couple hours of training, maybe a week of training at most, and that person is going to need to make a split-second decision in a classroom where, think of the shooting in Madison this week.
Yeah.
You've got all the kids in study hall. All of a sudden, a kid opens up their backpack and opens fire with a handgun. Your teacher is going to need to, in that split second, identify what's going on, not hit any of the other kids in the room, shoot one of your students, which like mentally putting yourself in the space of shooting a student is pretty intense.
Right.
And then do all of that in a matter of seconds with essentially no training. Like it's setting somebody up for failure.
And it's this firearm is the solution approach, I think is it's just not understood by people that it seems like a good idea on the surface. And I'm not saying there aren't situations where it wouldn't be appropriate or couldn't be an option, but it shouldn't be a primary option and it should be way, way down the list. And if you are going to choose to do that, there is a lot of responsibilities that come with it. I could, in Indiana, I've been pretty outspoken. I chaired our legislative committee for our state chiefs association for years. So I've had these arguments at the state house, not just in terms of school arming teachers, but also really Indiana being a constitutional carry state now, some of the ramifications that come with decisions like that. And again, my point is always, look, I just want to educate you people on what the practical reality of these decisions are. So let me ask you a question in your research. Like now, since we began arming teachers, do we have any cases where an armed teacher has stopped an active shooter event?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, there's never an armed teacher that has unfortunately, fortunately or fortunately, almost all these shootings at schools are very short duration incidents. When there's a planned attack, it ends in suicide, surrender, or the shooter being subdued by nearby students and staff, usually within the first minute or so. Um, Outside of planned attacks, the most common situation at a school is a fight that escalates into a shooting because a kid is a habitual gun carrier and they pull the gun out during the fight. They didn't plan to shoot anybody that day, but once, the fight goes down the hallway, they pull their gun. That kid is not hanging around the school. That kid is not headed to a closet to ambush a police officer during a secondary search. That kid's gone. Like they are running. They usually ditch the weapon somewhere on campus. So the chance, like, so say you have your fight in the hallway, a kid pulls a gun and takes some shots. What's an armed teacher going to do in that scenario? Very little, probably just increase the risk. If you have a shooting that occurs in a classroom, you know, that the teacher is able to pull their gun in their classroom and kill a student with a gun before anybody else gets hurt, really improbable. And if it's a teacher in one classroom and there's a shooting next door, well, schools now have locked doors, have fortified doors, have drop bars. The you like this, you need the SWAT team to get through a lot of classroom doors now. So there's no way your armed staff member is going to make it into the room to even have an impact on the incident. So I don't see
Yeah.
a lot of ways that an armed staff member would be likely to end an incident, but what I see is lots of ways that they increase risk. In
Yes.
my Google alerts, there are guns left in bathrooms. There are guns that are found by elementary school kids in bathrooms because, somebody goes to the bathroom and they leave it on the toilet paper holder. There are accidental discharges. In Delaware this month, two different police officers fired their guns, not police officers, school constables, 40-hour trained school constables accidentally fired their guns. Last week on a school playground, police officers handing out stickers to kids at the elementary school, and a kid fires his weapon while it's sitting in his holster. I think that as more people have firearms on school property, there's a higher likelihood of accidental discharges, and there's a higher likelihood of the kids getting their hands on one of those guns.
Yeah. And I want to touch on a few of those too, because it does highlight exactly what you're talking about. And you made my point before I got to ask the question, right? Like how many active shooters have armed teachers stopped? Zero. And the number of school resource officers, armed, trained police officers that have stopped school shooters is last time I thought maybe three. Very, very low. It's generally going to be the response that comes afterwards, but um,
Oh, it's
the
generally
risk.
over before the response.
Yes, long before then. Like almost every shooting that any cop ever responds to ever in their career, it's almost always over before. Now, sure, do you have to train and prepare for gunfights? Absolutely, it's a critical part of what we do. And I'm not saying there's not nuance here, and I know sometimes people when they listen to these types of discussions, if they're really pro Second Amendment, strong gun guy, they emotionally they react to this very quickly. It's not the guns, it's not the guns, it's not the guns. You're right, it is people, and it's. I want to get to the next point in a minute when we talk about maybe leakage in some of these early pre-incident indicators, these things that is like that are on display that a student is giving some of these early warning signs that they may be going down this path that we often ignore. But before that, I want to kind of touch on a couple of those other things. The people laugh about this, kind of joke about it, like how dumb can it be a cop or somebody that carries a gun to leave a gun in a bathroom? Well, listen, how dumb can somebody be to leave a child in a car seat in the back of a car? When you're
Leave a
used,
cell phone in an Uber.
yeah,
Leave your important work laptop on an airplane.
it happens, right? You're busy. Your mind is in different places. You forget about these things. For someone that carries a gun all the time, it's just this ubiquitous thing. I carried one. I still carry one. You go into a bathroom, people don't think about this, but if you're in clothes and you're wearing a holster inside of a belt, that gun just pushes your pants right down onto a dirty bathroom floor. So how do you have to negotiate that? Well, you have to take the weight out. So what do you do with that? There are ways you
Well,
can
then
roll your pants.
you need
Yeah,
somewhere to put it. And there are all of these ancillary pieces that don't get thought about in terms of arming school staff. There's a 30-year veteran police officer earlier this year in Massachusetts accidentally discharged his gun in a school bathroom because when he went to use the bathroom, there's nowhere to put the gun. So he hung it by the trigger guard on the clothes hook. Not a great idea, but he's been working in these schools for years. He's probably done that every single time he uses the bathroom for years. But this is the one time that the hook caught the trigger. He accidentally discharged and he ended up retiring from that. But that's because that is a systems problem. You
yes,
have a person with the gun, but you're not giving them a safe way to handle and store. And that's what's getting left out of the armed teacher, armed school staff, uh, minimally trained security guard or constable thing at school is you're giving somebody a high risk device, a device where if you have any fault with it, the chance of somebody getting killed or injured is pretty high. If that device isn't there, the chance of somebody getting killed or injured is essentially zero. So we need to understand it's not a gun thing, it's a risk equation. If you create a situation that has risk of serious injury or death, you need to have ways that you're going to mitigate and manage that risk. And if you don't have good risk mitigation, you're going to end up having accidents. I think, all these schools are mandating you need to have a armed officer in Texas and in Florida and a couple other states. That has to be the most boring job possible for a lot of these people. If
yeah.
you have somebody who's a cross-trained educator, they have something to do all day. If you have somebody who's exclusively an armed security guard to sit at this 200 kid elementary school in rural Texas, that guy's gonna be bored out of their mind. And that's why a lot of these accidental discharges are somebody practicing quick draws, somebody who's dry firing, somebody who's doing their own practice evolution. There were two guards that were practicing karate kicks, and one of them accidentally kicked the gun out of the other guy's holster, and it accidentally discharged. If you put people in situations with boredom, if you put people in situations without training, and you put people in situations where their weapons can either be mishandled, lost, or even taken from them, you're increasing risk. Nothing to do with guns, it's just increasing risk.
Maybe you're familiar with Michelle Walker's work, but she wrote a book called The Gray Rhino, and I talk about that multiple times. I've referenced her a lot, but the Gray Rhino, in law enforcement circles, it should ring familiar when I mention the word Gordon Graham or the name Gordon Graham, because Gordon is a very prolific trainer in the space, owner of Lexipol, former California highway patrolman. But he's famous for his line, right? If it's predictable, it's preventable. And when we had these, Nassim Taleb wrote, the Black Swan, and talks about like these unforeseen events, things that no one could have ever predicted these things happening. Those events are actually very rare. And what Michelle talks about is most of those incidents are actually what she would refer to as a gray rhino. Like, they're right there in plain sight. You can see them. You can predict that they're coming. And I really think it would be a great resource for people listening. If you've never read her book, go read it, because it highlights everything that you just mentioned there. We have these systems errors, and if we don't think about what might go wrong in advance, you're going to have these accidents. And you're right. I mean, I spent 4 years in the security police in the Air Force. The first couple of years was walking around airplanes. Yeah, literally in the US, like, the first couple weeks, you're on high alert, you're young, you've got this M16, and you're thinking about where all the terrorists are going to come from, how you're going to fight them. And then in about a week or two, you realize like you're counting rivets on planes, like just to keep your mind occupied from just the sheer boredom of what you're doing. You are now a visual deterrent, but you're not a real deterrent.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
yourself may be a risk
Yes.
at that point. And you talk about there aren't black swan events, that things are predictable. And something I've been talking about and writing about that I think is predictable. I don't want it to happen, but I think it's pretty likely that it'll happen. If a kid is plotting a school shooting, probably the most difficult part of that plot is obtaining the gun. In a lot of houses, the gun's available, but if it's not, that may be hard to get. And then if the school has any kind of security, then that's something they have to figure out how they're going to bypass to get that weapon inside. If a kid knows that their teacher's armed and they want to commit a school shooting, the simplest way to do that is if the gun is already there in the school.
Yeah.
If you can just take it from the teacher, you don't have to worry about where to get it. You don't have to worry about getting caught in advance. You don't need to worry about getting caught during the security screening. Most shootings start and end in the same room. It's most often classrooms during morning classes, and the most likely perpetrator is a current student at the school. If you can just take the gun from a teacher, then you have everything you need to commit the shooting in that exact scenario. And I don't think that at the state level or at the school district level, people understand how realistic that is as a threat and what it takes and how hard it is to defend a gun from somebody who's trying to take it from you.
Yeah. And that's a great discussion too. And a great example of that, in my last interview that I did with David Perez in his book, A Resilient Life. He talks about an incident early in his career where he's got this nice shiny leather holster. It's a single retention holster, which means it's got one snap on it. And he's in a foot chase. They catch the suspect. They got him on the ground. His partner tells him to cover him. He goes to grab his gun, and there's no gun in his holster. Somewhere in his foot chase, the gun came out of his holster. Um, these things are not uncommon. And so when you posted earlier this week about the firearm discharging from the bench, that that is clearly, to me, it was, well, either somebody is not telling us the full story about what was going on with the firearm itself, or the equipment was, as a negligent selection of equipment. Because if someone can reach into your holster and get their finger on your trigger, that is like, there shouldn't be any cop in America today carrying a holster that would allow that to happen. And so then you get into some of these issues of negligence, and I think in that case, maybe that's an agency, because there are some agencies that allow officers to choose which firearm they're going to carry, which holster they're going to use. And in this
And
day,
that's what's happening in schools.
yeah,
If you're an armed teacher it's really up to you in most cases what weapon you're going to carry, how you're going to carry it. And there's very little accountability for making sure that that person is trained and prepared to defend that gun in the fight of their life in a classroom.
And again, I'm not trying to be overly critical, but you use the word accidental too, and I think I sent you a note on this. That's terminology that we don't generally use. It's usually it's going to be negligent is going to be the primary reason for a firearm being discharged when it's not intentional. So, but there are cases where it can be unintentional. And I'm a I have a case. I haven't talked about this ever on on the podcast before. Probably one of the one of the worst days of my career as a police chief was getting the word. I was in a staff meeting with my leadership group, and we got word that one of our officers had been shot in the line of duty. Um, and as it turned out, the officer was shot by a fellow officer in the back as they were retreating out of a house. They had been doing a search. They were looking for a suspect, one on a warrant, and there was a large dog. You can probably find this incident on the internet and look. So I'm not telling anyone that anything they don't already know or can't see for themselves. But in that case, there was a large dog inside of a cage that had been barking and was restless, was trying to get out. Very, very aggressive dog. And as they were finishing up their search, the dog breaks open the cage. The cage literally falls apart and comes out. The officers go rushing out. They had had firearms in their hands because they had been clearing. And as they're rushing out the door, the officer, turned and ran into the door as one was in front of it. And his he had been indexed, but when he hit the door, his finger, went in right into the trigger guard and pulled the trigger, shot the round through the door and hit his fellow officer in the back. And fortunately, she survived and was able to return to duty one day. But that's these are highly trained officers that still run into these incidents where it just anytime you introduce a firearm into a high stress critical incident, there is a very high likelihood that something can go wrong or somebody can get injured. So
Yeah, and
uh,
I have a article that breaks down the video from the body cameras at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School, and that was an attack by a former student at the school. He had an AR style rifle. He had 600 rounds in his backpack, and he shot his way through a window of the school, opened the push bar, and went up to the third floor.
yeah.
But he didn't want to kill every victim possible, which is interesting. He just fires some shots, kills two people, wounds some others, and then just waits in a hallway for officers to arrive. And as they're getting there, he goes back into a computer lab. And the point where this connects to your story is you've got a bunch of different patrol officers. They're all at the door of the computer lab, and they all push in at exactly the same time. And the body cam shows a guy with a handgun who's behind another officer that has a rifle. And as they enter the room, the door is kind of at the front right. The shooter's sitting kind of in the back left corner and moves more towards the center. And so as the first officer with the rifle goes in, he starts left, but then he comes back right. And you see the officer with the pistol fires his first shot to the left side of this guy's head. And then as he weaves across, his second shot goes right by the right ear. So this officer was an inch two different times from getting shot in the back of the head by the officer behind him. And that's because you have these different guys doing a really technical kind of room
Yep.
entry with no coordinated movement at all. But that incident never gets studied, and nobody will ever look at what went right or wrong there because nobody got killed. And if you added then an armed staff member, a minimally qualified school constable, armed teacher into that scenario, the likelihood of somebody getting shot in the back, the wrong person getting shot, and doing a dynamic entry into a classroom and not realizing there's an armed teacher covering the door, thinking that they're defending the students. These opportunities for somebody to get either accidentally killed by another officer, negligently killed by another officer, or shot by another security guard or teacher. It's just we're taking risk, and we are stacking additional risks on it voluntarily. And that doesn't seem like a smart way to do business.
And we're doing it without any evidence to suggest that it's the right approach. Just a big experiment. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're just going to roll the dice and see what happens. And again, it comes right back to Gordon Graham, right? It's predictable and it's preventable. And sadly, I think you're going to be in a lot of situations where you're going to say, "I told you so."
Yeah, and it
I
might
told you
happen for
so.
no reason, which is one
Yeah,
of the worst things. I mean, swatting is a big problem that police departments have not figured out yet.
yeah, we're
And
we're dealing with
in
that here.
Yeah, there have been two different accidental discharges inside of schools during swatting calls. And that's because the officers are high intensity. They think they're, you know, going to the biggest call of their life, and they end up accidentally firing their weapon during a swatting response inside a school. Those two were both in elementary schools. What happens when you have an armed staff member in that mix? What happens when you have the janitor who's holding the mop in the hallway, when you've got your minimally trained security officer, constable? You can take a situation that was a prank, probably orchestrated by somebody in another country, and you can now turn that into a deadly situation where there was no danger of anybody being shot, but now you've created a situation where somebody might get killed.
And all you have to do is do a Google search on blue incidents. It happens all the time. Very, very unfortunate. And we train for that inside of policing. And then if you've ever worked in an undercover unit, we train everybody, but that's one we pound that into their heads, right? Like people responding don't know who you are. You've got beards, you've got tattoos, you've got all these things that on the outward appearance. People don't know you're a police officer, and you have to, in a way, have to have this duality of thought. Like, yes, I'm a police officer, but I'm also undercover. They don't know I'm a police officer, so I have to react. I can't react like a cop when the uniform officers show up or other plainclothes officers show up.
Yeah, and that
Time,
happened at the
time and
STEM
time again,
school.
happens all the time.
Yeah, that happened at the STEM school in Colorado in 2019. There was an armed security officer on the opposite end of a huge campus. The active shooter call goes out in the school. It's on the other end of campus, but he doesn't really know where it is. There's a plainclothes officer who's coming through the door, and the security guard opens fire in the hallway on the plainclothes officer. All of his shots miss because, as we know, people generally suck at shooting during high stress situations.
Right.
But the security guard ends up shooting two students. So,
Yeah.
so now you have an incident on the opposite end of the school. You've got two wounded students. You have an officer that was almost shot. You have a security guard who's shot people. Um, we create all of this extra danger and extra risk, as you said, without any evidence that it's actually going to change the outcome. Because at that school, it was students who'd subdued the attackers before police officers got to them.
So let's talk about evidence-based approaches because and we mentioned it earlier. I want to spend a few minutes. I want to be respectful of your time. I could talk about this all day, but when we think about left of bang, here being in a university town, I got introduced to people doing some evidence-based research, some data visualization. One thing led to another. Maybe you're familiar with Abish Malik and Scott Suraki. They're a university project here at Purdue is eventually became a company called DaVista Technologies, and one of their, they have the Heimdall software. But in that, like, using AI and using predictive analytics, rather than thinking about like the predpol type of approach, like where's the next crime going to occur, take these same methodologies and take data sets, data points that are measurable, that are things that we have access to, and let's try to identify who might be likely to that's entering into these risk categories from a low risk to a high risk because of things that are going on in their life. Some schools, I think, are really good at capturing some of this data. Our local school system, we use something called Quest. That is it's brilliant. It's been in place for a long time, but it's basically a system that helps. identify students who might be in crisis or having things that are going on, outside of school, inside of school, that might lead to them having, some performance issues inside of school, but then also can lead to behavioral issues. So getting left of bang, getting left of boom, however some people like to express that. I think that's probably our most logical course. I think that's where we should be going, and there are people working on it. But what are your
It's our
thoughts about that?
cheapest. Yeah,
Yes.
it's our cheapest, our easiest option is to prevent an attack before it starts. And I think a big part of that is realizing school shootings are not random. They are very rarely committed by an outsider with no connection to the campus for no reason. Almost always a current or recently former student at the school. That student has talked about violence for weeks, months, or even years before the attack. They've almost always told other students about the plan. They almost always have left clues online with posts, writings, journals, chats. They are asking for help. They are hoping to get caught right up until the moment that the shooting happens, because it's a cry for help. It's a cry for attention, not in the sense of notoriety attention, really, of more, I'm in crisis, I need help, I'm suicidal. The Oxford, Michigan school shooting a couple of years ago, he is writing over and over that he needs help. The CVPA school shooter in his manifesto, the doctors aren't helping him. He's not getting mental health support. He's actively suicidal. He just wants to die. That is the same message over and over. These aren't secret plots. There are plots that people want to be detected, and they're making overt statements about. I have a study of 125 averted school shootings from 2018 to 2022. 80% of those averted school shootings happened because a student provided information to a trusted adult about a classmate who was making statements about violence. All we need to do is have relationships where kids trust an adult to tell them when there's a problem. And those adults need to take meaningful action. And kind of the last point on that is this shooting in Madison, Wisconsin this week. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know the motive yet. But one piece of absolute evidence is the shooter's father. The banner photo on his social media is his daughter at the gun club shooting skeet. He's very proud of that. He's proud to be, doing sport shooting with his daughter. That's totally fine. Her t-shirt is the band, the German rock band that the Columbine shooters played in their basement tapes. It's the same t-shirt that one of the Columbine shooters was wearing. She's making an overt warning. She's saying there's no reason for a 15-year-old in Wisconsin to be wearing the t-shirt from a 90s underground German rock band. She is saying there's something wrong. Please, somebody notice this shirt. Ask me why I'm wearing it. Ask me why I need help. All we need to do is spot these warning signs, take meaningful action on them, empower kids to try to get help for their classmates, and we can stop almost every one of these attacks.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you about that. It's always interesting to me when and I was following the thread on your post there on LinkedIn, and immediately you have some people start commenting like, well, no, you can't blame that band. You can't blame that. And like they're missing the point entirely. And and it's sometimes in social media is just not necessarily the right place to have these discussions. But I think you can open up people to this idea and the thought that what you're saying, it's a cry for help. She may not even know that it's a cry for help.
Mm-hmm.
She's not doing that intentionally. It might not even be a case where I'm going to show you, but it is a peek into her psyche. Why is she wearing that shirt? So when you have a trusted adult who does take action, because we've seen time and time again where the adults then dismiss it. They go into, and Gavin DeBecker writes about this a lot, right? Where, one of the first things that we do is deny, psychologically, we can see the warning signs, but we go into denial because that just puts us, psychologically in a safer space, but it's actually creating more danger and more risk when you deny. Anytime
And
that
we need
something,
cure.
yeah, when they're pulling, when something's pulling like that sixth sense is being alerted, something's not right. You got to pull on the thread. You got to trace it back, and then only dismiss it once you've gone through whatever the checks are going to be. But we've seen time and time again, where officers are alerted by school personnel or another parent, and they go into a dismissal phase. And you've posted about that, and we've seen people try to defend officers. Well, they can't predict the future, they can't see, and it's not their job to predict the future. It's not their job to um, try to understand if this is going to be a shooting or not. What their job is to investigate, ask the questions that need to be asked, and refer to the people that need to be referred to. Because in that, just let's use that the one you're talking about. Let's say somebody does recognize that, they do point it out, they let a school counselor or an adult know, they look into it, they realize, hey, this is definitely something concerning. We have someone that's shooting a firearm and has this connection. Let's talk to her, ask her, and then, Dad, were you aware that this shirt, had this meaning? Oh, no, I wasn't. Okay, well, is there anything going on here? If nothing else, even if you don't say, hey, Dad, are you locking up your firearms at night? Are you making sure that your children don't have access to them? Hopefully now, because any parent is going to know. Like, they can't say I didn't know. They're going to know at least on some level that something is out of the norm. Um, and I can say that with about 99.9% certainty. I'm
Yeah.
sure there's always things that happen, like, oh, I had no idea that was going to happen. We may not be able to predict the severity of things that happen, but we can certainly see when our own children, are going down a path that, is for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah, I think that that can be the final takeaway here in this discussion is that prevention, whether it's a school shooting, whether it's a kid who's suicidal, whether it's a shooting in a public place, a workplace, wherever else, if everybody just has a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of compassion towards other people, you can detect almost all of these problems. Somebody who's in crisis wants help. And there are some researchers that I've written a number of papers with, and they had a Department of Justice grant to do interviews with convicted mass shooters. So the ones who didn't die, the ones who were in jail, they would sit down and interview them about their life history and what got them to this point. And there was one question that they asked every one of those perpetrators, and that was, who could have stopped this attack? And they got the same answer from all of them. And they all said anyone could have stopped this attack. If one person had showed a little interest and a little compassion and talked to them, they could have resolved this conflict before it got to the point of violence. So I think it's a workplace, it's a school, it's your neighborhood, it's your church. Mass violence isn't random, and we all have the opportunity to prevent it. We just need to, have some compassion, some curiosity, and talk to people.
Yeah, that's a great way to close it. I appreciate it. We could talk for hours about this, but I really do appreciate the time that you've spent with me helping, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing. Uh, Keep fighting the good fight.
We didn't even get to
Yeah,
talk about fighting. This
I know
whole
that was part.
podcast was supposed to be about defensive tactics, and we never
Yeah,
even touched on it once.
so we'll have to set up a second interview, and just a little teaser for that is, the idea of, how much training people should need, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a police officer. I think in the end, yeah, that we're going to need another hour to talk about that, if not longer. We'll just leave that teaser for here for now. But in the interim, uh, how if people are interested in your work, where can they find it? What's the easiest and best way to get in touch with you and get access to that?
Yeah, if you just put K through 12 school shooting database into Google, you'll find all the information. It's the top hit. Unfortunately, there was a school shooting this week, so about 500,000 people around the world went there to look for information about school shootings. You can also subscribe to my podcast. It's called Back to School Shootings. It's all about research on this topic, and it's professors, been police officers, police chiefs, public officials, trauma surgeons, all kinds of different perspectives on prevention. And then I also have a weekly newsletter that's out on Substack, and it's the school shooting data analysis report. And there's a subscribe button to that on my website. It's free.
Awesome. Appreciate it. This is the Cop Optimizer podcast, Cop Optimizer. It's not just about physical, mental, emotional well-being. It's all about performance. And performance starts with asking yourself the question of, can I do better? We all have a duty to make sure that we're being the best cops that we can be, which requires a lot of work. So pay attention to this work. Hope is not a plan. It's not a strategy. It's a recipe for disaster. Get to work, read the information. Don't wait for something like this to happen. Get out in front of it, and you got to start today if you haven't already really started. So, David, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. And until the next episode, we're going to be 1042.